Hello, listeners. This is NGO Soul+Strategy. Conflicts, conflict management, conflict resolution, mediation. Somehow, the skill to engage in constructive conflict often comes up, at least anecdotally, it seems to me, as a weak area in social sector organizations. I have some basic background in conflict management, particularly as a leadership skill, but only basic. I'm not a specialist. And therefore, I'm always on the lookout for people with expertise in this area so that I can keep learning, and the same for you as the audience. Guess what? I am now in the lucky situation to be part of a broader team of consultants and coaches that includes Nathalie Thompson. And Nathalie has exactly this skill set. So the logical next step was to ask her to come on the show. So Nathalie, welcome.
Thank you, Tosca. I'm looking forward to sharing my experiences and observations in conflict resolution.
And you have a lot of experience, so that will be very solid. So Nathalie, just to introduce you for a moment to our audience, you are the owner of your own consulting firm called Fivefold Consulting. You are a core practitioner as well as faculty member at the Corentus team coaching company, where I'm also a core practitioner. You're a mediator, importantly, a facilitator and a coach. You also teach, right, in the field of conflict mediation. And you're currently an Ombuds at an institution in Washington, D.C. here in the U.S. Just a quick question about Fivefold Consulting. What is that about?
Well, it came from a couple of different sources. I have a Celtic heritage, and the number 5 is very important in that. And both my children are Chinese, and there's a concept in China called fivefold, and it relates to when you think of folding paper, and every time you fold it, it's harder to rip and harder to rip and harder to rip. So it involves 5 elements, but I think of it as the paper being folded 5 times as the 5 different skills and contributions I make with people as I work. And so it makes people stronger. So.
It makes people stronger. That's a deep meaning. And the funny thing is that my company name is called Five Oaks Consulting, but I do not have nearly as deep an explanation for that as you do. So my hat off to you. Well, Nathalie, let's start with how you got into the field of conflict management, both as a leadership skill, as a team skill, right? But also the field of mediation, facilitation, team coaching, and ombuds work. How did you get into that?
All right. Well, like many people, there's what you think you're going to do when you graduate college, and then there's what you end up doing.
Oh, yeah.
University. So I was a psychology criminal justice major, and I started off as a counselor, and I did that for a few years. And in one of my jobs, I actually left that, and I was working in an organization temporarily, and my boss said, there's a new degree at our college that sounds just like you. It's like psychology in the workplace. And it was human resource development. So I went to interview with the dean of that school, who ended up also being an alumni of Michigan State. And so I was one of the first people, one of the first classes for that master's degree in human resource development. And that brought me into training. And that brought me into human resources, where I spent the rest of my corporate career. And through there, I was doing a lot of training and internal consulting with groups. It could be training, but it could also be coming in and helping them have discussions that they needed to have, kind of that HR, when there's issues between the management or team members. And when I left, that just seemed to continue. I was being asked back by my organization to come in and do work. And then one of my friends said, you should come to Northern Virginia Mediation Service and work with us. So that's where it started. And I went through all of their training and became a Virginia certified mediator through them, and started with court mediation. Formally, I was always doing mediation, but formally doing mediation then in the courts.
In the court system. Okay. Okay. Now, am I right? Can we start by distinguishing a couple of categories at which conflict mediation can play out? So there's obviously the interpersonal conflict level, right? There's the team or unit level conflict, right? And then there's possibly an organizational level conflict management systems, capabilities, etc. So does your work in principle across all your clients, does it play out at all these three levels, or do you specialize in one of those three? And is there maybe another level, by the way, an inter-institutional conflict setting as well?
Yeah, I would say I'm not playing too much in the inter-institutional level, although I'm seeing some possibilities on the horizon for that. I think when I started, it was primarily in the courts in Fairfax County here, and then other than the work, I did a lot of interpersonal. I do a lot of coming into an organization of any type. It could be a community organization or a for-profit organization, and doing interpersonal mediation, often like management and employees or between employees. And then that's graduated. I've always done a lot of teamwork, you quote unquote, what we used to call team building, but a lot of team development work where I help teams have conversations that they needed to have. And so that, I guess, would be the interpersonal and the department level. And sometimes interdepartment level. I wouldn't say that I've done a lot at the high level organizationally, except in my work as an ombuds, and I can talk about that briefly separately.
Yeah, the term ombuds is not necessarily a term that everybody across the world knows, right? So tell us what an ombuds.
Well, an ombud is a Swedish term that means representative of the people. So it's basically you are an ear to the people, and you help give voice to people in an organization's, well, the people in the organization. You can be an internal ombuds like I am. I'm an organizational ombuds for, it's no secret, architect of the Capitol. But people, like a lot of hospitals have ombuds, most educational institutions have ombuds, and they may deal with people internally and externally.
But just to be really hyper practical, so what kind of issues can people in those organizations bring to you that need what kind of addressing?
They can bring pretty much everything. An ombuds, just like a mediator, is someone who is a neutral, impartial. I'm independent, so I'm external to the organization. I'm not a part of HR. And that's one of the challenges, is making sure people don't see you as that. But it's an absolutely confidential resource and neutral, where people could bring, they're having issues with a manager, or they've got a policy concern or procedure, or I've had several cases where people have made Americans with Disability Act requests, like for special equipment or something, and it's not been resolved. So people can ask me to look into something for them as a neutral and find out the status. It could be a performance management issue. It could be a harassment or bullying issue. It can be anything.
Okay, that's helpful.
If they just want an ear, or they want to have a conversation themselves but don't know how to do it. So I can be a coach, I can be a trainer, I can be a mediator, and I also can do preventative stuff like provide training for an organization. I also, importantly, you prepare reports. I can raise issues with an organization that an employee may not want to raise themselves. Yeah. And I can raise it in a way that doesn't identify anyone, but yet it's an issue that an organization needs to address. Like I've been getting, this is the 5th XYZ complaint I've had in the last 6 months. I think you all need to take a look at this and consider setting a policy. So I can make
Oh, okay. That makes it much more concrete. That was helpful to me, and I'm sure to the listeners.
So that's my work at the organizational level, to answer your question there.
It is, right? Yes. Yeah. Okay, that's at the org level. Yeah. And I was pinpointing that a little bit amongst others because, like in leadership trainings, and I've been part of delivering those, interpersonal conflict or sometimes team level conflict are skills that people can be trained in. But at least in the nonprofit, particularly international nonprofit and NGO spheres, organizational level systems and capabilities for dealing with conflict are actually quite underemphasized. At least there has been some writing on that in the last 5 years or so. I think that's been helpful. So but let's first back to some basics. So I'll let me introduce two topics and just hear from you. Are those topics have come up when I received my basic training in conflict mediation, and see, are they still salient? And if so, in what ways? So task versus relationship conflict. That's generally considered a basic but helpful distinction in the field of conflict mediation. Can you comment on task versus relationship conflict?
Yeah. So if you're talking about tasks, the actual getting of the work done and how it gets done and what is the work to get done.
Yeah.
I would say that that's often a foundation or a precursor to relationship conflict, because people often have, they're very interrelated. People often have differing opinions, or even competing goals on what
Yeah.
and I mean, I'm working with a group right now. There's two different departments and they have completely different missions. And I'm not going to say what the work is. And yet they have to work, their work is completely interdependent on each other to get their work done. And it's causing, well, first, it's a huge task conflict because their missions are different. In terms of how they do the work, what work is priority and all of that. But then because of that, it's resulting in a lot of interpersonal conflict of you're right, I'm wrong, and building coalitions, within the organization, even across the department, because some people agree with the others. So there's a huge relationship there, Tosca.
That makes sense to me. That makes sense to me. But although is it fair to say that sometimes humans can have relationship-based conflicts that are not touching upon task at all?
Oh, absolutely.
Due to personality differences, sensitivities from somebody reminds somebody from somebody with who they had a complicated relationship in their past, or.
Oh, yes. And that happens all the time. It's funny what you said about it could be something from the past. I worked with someone a couple years ago, and she's like, I don't know what it is about this person, but just when I see this person and I have to sit next to him in a meeting, I can just feel it. It's just the tension that she felt in her body going up. And we talked about it for a long time. And then it dawned on her one day, believe it or not, she goes, you know what? It's her perfume. It reminds me of this person in her past,
Yeah.
and who she really didn't get along with. And she couldn't it took her a long time to realize that,
Yeah.
so, but it could be other things. I mean, that's kind of a funny story, but yeah, it was impacting on that. But yeah, the culture, where you come from, your experiences, and I think so much is around the communication, Tosca. People hear words and things people say and how they say them, and we hear everything through our filter.
Yeah.
It may not have anything to do with what the other person intended or not, but I interpret those words and behaviors in a certain way.
Yeah.
I have expectations for other people that they know nothing about because it's just based on my experience. And so because of that, I see people, take offense or get upset over a lot of things.
Yeah, there are many possible reasons. But yeah, just for those of us who are not deeply steeped in this field, I think a useful distinction still to make. Another one that I was exposed to is from a tool perspective, to get is interest-based negotiation and problem solving. Would you mind briefly defining what that is about and commenting on whether that still is a helpful approach in conflict management skill building?
Yeah, I think it really is. And whether people call it interest-based or not, I think it's fundamental in resolving problems and conflict, because what we're talking about with interests, people come to a problem and they say, I know what the problem is. We need new employees. Well, no, that's a solution. An interest would be, why are you saying that? Why is that your answer? Because it's getting underneath to that why. What's important? Any solution you and I come up with, Tosca, what does it need to do for you? What does it need to do for me? Because all human beings have needs. And when we get into conflict, positive behavior is because our needs are being met or about to being met, and that negative is because they're at risk or not being met. And if we can understand that, number one, what we often find, that's where we often find common ground. We've come to different solutions or positions, but sometimes for the same reasons, because we're afraid, or there's an issue around resources, or
We
something.
feel threatened. There's a sense of loss,
Exactly.
whatever.
Exactly. So if we can understand the concrete needs as well as the human needs, like the need to be understood or recognized, if we can understand that and
Yeah.
then talk at that level to resolve the issue, that's the key.
That is the key. Yeah. So when people express positions, something that they say they want, then try to inquire about what actually the person needs, which is underneath the what they say they want, and can sometimes be quite revelatory, and then can lead to more productive negotiation, right?
Exactly.
Okay. Now, of course, I have to ask you, this is a global podcast, and national cultural differences as applied to how conflict is, even whether it's acknowledged or not, how it is labeled and how it is treated, are vast, right? There are vast cross-national differences.
Sure.
And they can even also show up within a big country like the US that has people that originate from many different cultures, right? So for instance, I'm Dutch, as you know, and so Dutch people are infamous for their directness and the perception that we are not scared of conflict, and that we quote unquote say it like it is, but not necessarily in a very skillful way. I'm simplifying, but so how, without going into an in-depth course on this, but how can people most skillfully work around these differences in culture when it comes to conflict?
Oh, it's an interesting question, Tosca. I'm just beginning to get into the more international level with Mediators Without Borders. I'm a newbie in that arena, but on cultural, I like to think that everyone is unique. So culture is part of that. So I think when I'm working with anyone or any group, one of the things I do is I like to work with people one-on-one before I bring them together, and build that relationship first. So
Okay.
even if I don't have a vast knowledge of your culture, what I can do in that conversation, is talk with people and find out what's important to them. And I can find out, what would be a good conversation for them. Coming at it from a position of curiosity. So if we were to have this conversation, what would it look like for you? How would you need it to be structured? Are you able to say what you need to say, or do you need me to, how would we raise these issues with you? I find that goes a long way for addressing some of that. I don't think it addresses all of it, because I think that's even a cultural thing right there, the willingness to talk to me one-on-one.
I was going to say, or what do you do, Nathalie, when people do not want to disclose their true thoughts and emotions, most importantly?
I can't make anyone do anything, nor should I. And I don't see myself as a salesperson to make it happen. What I do ask people, I'll just share observations sometimes, Tosca, and I'll say, Tosca, it seems like there's something else that's really important for you. And, I'm wondering, what I can do to help you with that. Or if you're not willing to share that, we can't solve things we don't talk about or raise. Is there another way it could be raised? Is there someone else that should be involved in this conversation? I also think, though, I explore with people, Tosca, what's the price you're paying by not disclosing this? What's the price? You're paying it now. Is it keeping you up at night? Are you worrying about it? Are you talking about it with other people? And I also think, really importantly, who else is paying the price? Because you're in this, are other people seeing it or being impacted by this not being resolved? But I do explore with people, what do they need in order to talk about it? And if it's to talk to someone else other than me, that's fine.
Yeah. So I hear a lot of coaching questions in your approach.
Yeah, it is coaching. It's definitely a coaching process.
Yeah. How about gender and conflict? Attitudes towards conflict, how conflict is expressed, if it is expressed at all. What are the gender dimensions that from your practice, as well as your knowledge of the literature, of the research, you can speak to?
An interesting question.
Because we know, right, from the literature of
Yeah.
gender and leadership that when women express, for instance, a high emotion, whether it's anger or dissension, etc., it is perceived by others around them, on average, right?
Sure.
If you look at large data sets, as differently than when men do the same, for instance.
Yeah, if you're talking about the public expression, like in a meeting or something,
Yes.
yeah, I would agree. And I've worked with, it's like, well, I don't want to bring it up because I'm like, have you brought that up at the meeting? Have you stopped someone from interrupting you? And yeah, the answer is yeah, but if I do that, there's words we call women who do that.
Exactly.
You're aggressive versus he's assertive. So yeah, I do see that. When it comes to being in like talking with me one-on-one, I don't see I see other things that cause disparity there, not so much gender. When I bring people together, though, is where, depending on what, and that's why I meet with people one-on-one, because there's all different sources of power. And let's be honest, particularly in the Western world, in the workplace, there is a perceived power just by being male.
Yeah.
So one part of the job of a mediator is to balance that. And that's why I meet with people one-on-one. I want to know what's going to happen. And it is, again, coaching, Tosca. And it's like, okay, so what is it that you want to say to this person? Okay, well, say it to me. Let me say it to you now. How do you think this person might hear that way? It's another way to say it, because here's what happened to me when I heard it. Maybe there's another way to say that. So I think it's looking at that kind of thing. But I think it's more the public play out, Tosca.
Yeah, and that's what I was referring. But I find it very interesting the way you then first one-on-one work with the person, for instance, saying, say it to me, and then you reflect back to them how that comes across, and if that's the most effective way, will the other person be able to hear it, etc., right? Yeah, because there's plenty of research that says that women have to more carefully walk this balance between warmth and competence and assertion, right? Because they are perceived differently depending on that balance. Yeah. So your work is both on mediation, is both in the public sector, it's in meaning the government sector, it's in the private sector, and there is also a nonprofit dimension to your work, right?
Yeah,
When you first started to use conflict mediation techniques towards nonprofit organizations, social sector ones, did you have to adapt your approaches at all, or do these methodologies basically work cross-sector?
Yes and yes. What's kind of the HR answer to everything? It depends. Well, again, I think everything is unique. I think the biggest thing I've seen in the nonprofits that I've been just becoming into, because most of my work has been educational organizations, as you said, and government, and then, public organizations or for profit. One of the biggest things I see is people are so nice.
Yes. Talk
so
more about that.
And because they're so nice, and their mission is so important, which is great, but because they're so nice, it is sometimes hard for them to be assertive with one another, to hold one another accountable, to say what needs to be said. It's kind of, and I think all of us, most people have some of that, but I think sometimes, particularly in these very mission-driven organizations, that if I say that to you, then I'm not a good person. It's like, no, you need to tell people your truth, number one. You don't have to say it in a mean way or a hurtful way, but I need to tell you that you're behind on your project and it's implementing my work or it's impacting the mission. So I think that's the biggest thing I've seen. Once we can sit down and talk about that, and say, and again, I think it's a coaching thing, Tosca, of what's keeping you from saying this to that person? Well, I don't want to be seen as this. and whatever, if it's a religious organization, I don't want to seem as non whatever. And I'm like, is that really non whatever? you know,
Hmm.
um, and what's the impact again of not bringing it up? This
I
is
know, including for the mission of the organization.
that's right. And it's also hurting them too because you're carrying it around.
Yeah.
So I think again, it's a coaching moment and saying, and one of the things I do try and get people to see, in my opinion, is it's not being kind to not tell people the truth.
Hmm.
Because you're not giving me an opportunity. I also think it can be disrespectful because you're not giving me an opportunity to fix it.
Yeah.
Which I think most like when I think of religious organizations, most religions believe in apologizing and atoning and and making up. So
Mhm.
yeah, we can be kind and respectful and discuss the difficult things.
Yeah, yeah. It's a very tricky thing because anecdotally, I'm not the only person um, uh, who, in a role of advisor or consultant or former participant, right, notices a fair amount of conflict aversion or conflict avoidance in the organizational culture. But yet, that doesn't mean that, for instance, aggression is not displayed, right? It just comes out very indirectly
Mhm.
and actually just as destructive, but just in a much more subtle and kind of lingering way,
Mhm.
right? So that's a generalization that I'm saying. So that means there are lots of organizations who don't have that, but that's what a lot of practitioners would characterize the sector with the. But then there are campaigning organizations, advocacy organizations that are populated by people who have very strong advocacy stances on what's right or wrong in the world, are often, well, not often, are sometimes fairly black and white around that.
Yeah.
And bring the external advocacy stance also into the organization, right? And then you have actually a very combative culture, but where there is not enough interpersonal skills to actually talk across differences. And it becomes a bunch of shouting and persuasion mode. Have
Right.
you any observations on that? Or is that not
Um,
really in your
I
realm?
don't. I mean, I know what you're talking about. I don't think I've worked in an overall combative organization at this point. I've worked with like departmental sections that are that way or culturally. I do work in some organizations that highly scientific that also deal with regulatory matters. And what I see there is kind of what you're talking about. I've got a regulatory group over here that are concerned with making sure whatever the conclusions of this group are
Yeah.
about the safety of a product, whatever that might be.
Yeah.
Well, here's the legal arm that reports to Congress and the constituencies out in the world that want to sue every time someone says you can no longer do this. So that's a combativeness I see.
Yeah.
Um, and the challenge, and it's almost set up that way because
Yes.
this is the legal arm of the organization, and they're dealing with lawsuits all the time.
Yeah.
This is over here,
Yeah.
and you're going, yeah, but we're doing what's right for the data, for the world, or for humans, whatever it might be. So there's that. And that's one organization. I'm just beginning to talk with them about how they can bridge the divide internally because they're dealing with lawsuits outside. Does that mean we have to fight with our internal colleagues?
Exactly. Those are two different things in principle, right? Yeah. Yeah. And again, we are making a couple of general observations. So again, there are
Sure.
many organizations that don't respond to what we just described, but it's interesting. So from a conflict prevention perspective, Nathalie, how can organizations, particularly social sector organizations, how can they prevent conflicts from escalating? I'm not saying from starting, but from escalating in a way where they no longer constructive conflict.
Yeah, and thank you for saying that not starting. Conflict is a good thing. I know it gets a bad rap, but it's because of differences that we get creativity and we get new ideas and we
Yeah,
gain new perspectives. It's the only way you learn because there's
yeah,
something different than what you already know. I think the key is not escalating it. So I think some of the key things are getting to know each other up front, clarifying expectations. So if you're working on a team, it's getting to know one another, getting to know preferences, getting to know styles. So on a personal level, I
Mm-hmm.
don't mean you need to be deep into someone's personal life, but into the level we need to know each other to effectively work together. And
Mm.
then, so that's kind of that interpersonal side. We're human
Yeah.
beings and we need to be human beings and be treated as human beings, and find ways to treat each other with dignity and respect. Then there's the task side you mentioned earlier. I think it's about really clarifying, goals and expectations, no matter how we do the work. This is what I said before about interests and positions. No matter how we do the work, how you do it, I do it, there's lots of different ways to do it. But at the end of the day, what needs to happen?
Mm-hmm.
It needs to do this, it needs to be within these parameters. So let's have that conversation, then go back to then what does that mean in terms of how we do the work? And how can we do it together, given our different styles? What do you bring to the table? What do I bring to the table? What does this person bring to the table? And then work together to come up with that strategy to approach the work. And,
Mm.
in our friend, in the words of our esteemed colleague, Alexander Caillet,
Yes.
think of what he talks about with breakdowns, and that's a perfect model. I also do restorative justice work, and it's a very restorative model. When you do have disagreements or a breakdown, things don't go the way we agreed.
Mm-hmm.
Let's agree now how we're going to talk about that.
Upfront.
We're going to raise it up front. I'm going to bring it to you one-on-one, Tosca. And here we're going to ask each other, well, what was supposed to happen? Well, what did happen? What was the gap? Why do we think that happened? And what was my part? Not blame. We get so stuck on blame. But what do I own? What do you own? You're
Mm-hmm.
right. I did not review that document by this date, or you're right,
Mm.
I didn't ask this question to clarify that. So talking about what we both own and then problem solving to go forward. But I think it's really important to discuss that up front at the beginning.
I
How are we
like that very
handling
much.
disagreements? Yeah.
Yeah, and that is Nathalie is referring to the so-called 6 questions framework of Corentus. Again, Corentus is the team coaching group that Nathalie and I are both a part of, and that is a very helpful um, framework. So getting towards the end of our time together, Nathalie, there is one thing that is, I don't know, it's a sense that I have, and it's reinforced. So it's a sense from my own practice, and it's reinforced by some publications in the public media, as well as some journals that are about the social sector, where journalists and analysts have noted that in the last, let's say, 5 years, in some of the more progressive social movements and nonprofits, etc., there seems to be more internal strife that spills out onto the streets, spills out into the media, makes organizations very becoming very navel gazing, because they just can't work through the conflict, and it becomes a chronic kind of situation. And which then, when I observe that, makes me very worried that we're losing our eye on the ball, meaning the outcomes that we externally are supposed to, mission-wise, are supposed to contribute to, right? And in the meantime, the world is going to hell in a handbasket. If you look this year at the, what some people call the poly crises that are happening, it's quite frightening.
Mm-hmm.
And have you noticed that, or is that just me, that there seems to be more internal strifes in progressive organizations?
Yes, I would say I see that too. I don't know I have an answer to it. And I actually think it's an extension of the polarization that's going on elsewhere.
Okay.
I think as we're looking external and we see, well, this is more extreme, this is more extreme, there's this polarization. We're part of that too, and it's impacting us too, and it's impacting people that are within those organizations. And I think it starts becoming, this is the one true way.
Yes.
mainstream, this is the way. And losing the eye on the ball, as you say, I think we start forgetting ourselves that, there's lots of ways.
Yeah.
And when we start saying there's one way, that should be a symptom that organizations pay attention to, as soon as that start being said. Because I think the conversation we had earlier was that, um, my way is the right way, and you're not pure enough in your mission to this,
Yeah.
in your allegiance to the mission. And my question is, well, what's pure enough? Yeah, so I do see it, and I think organizations need to be very careful. But I think it's a symptom of what's going on in the bigger world.
Yeah, that's kind of depressing,
We
but
need to
I'm afraid you're right.
I think they need to sit down, and they need to name it and say, we see this happening, and
Yeah.
what's happening to us here, and what does that mean for us as an organization. They need to have a conversation around. They need to be willing to have a conversation around it, and get back to what's the bigger picture, as you're saying. Because if
Get
they
back to
don't, what's the price they're going to pay?
yes.
They're going to break
Yeah.
apart.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And that sometimes happens, right? Yeah, anyway, it's an amorphous thing that I brought up, but it worries me.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to run it by you. Well, we have to bring this to a close. So, Nathalie, where can people go if they want to learn more about your practice as a mediator, an ombuds, as a teacher, as a coach, if they want more help with their organization's conflict mediation skills or their own as a leader or a manager?
Sure. Well, to know more about me, you can go to my website, which
Mm-hmm.
is fivefoldconsulting.com with the number 5.
Mm-hmm.
And to contact me, people can just send me an email at Nathalie@fivefoldconsulting.com. Just make sure you spell Natalie with an H. So, and if I can't help you, or if you're looking for resources, I have a pretty large cadre of colleagues that would
I
do
bet.
field, and I'm happy to direct people to whatever resources they might need.
Okay. I'll make sure that those two links will be an email. Thank you for being willing to give your email. It is an area that has, at least in the international NGO community, has gotten more explicit attention in the last 5 to 8 years or so, but still is, I would say, is an underdeveloped capability, especially team conflict and organizational level conflict, I would say. So I'm glad I was able to get you on the show to speak about this. And so with that, I want to thank you, Nathalie, for your insights on this really important topic. And thank you, listeners, for sticking with us. If you found this podcast episode stimulating, then be sure to check out some other episodes in my podcast that focus on conflict. For instance, there is a recent episode with Daniel Genberg about the same issue. We also have some episodes on organizational ethics, such as episode 37 and 36, virtue narratives, and other things. So check it out. You can find these episodes and more, not just on my website, 5, also the number 5, oaksconsulting.org, but also on my YouTube channel. And one last thing is, if you've been wanting to get some kind of advice, but you don't have the budget right now to engage in a longer term consultation or coaching or team coaching process, I now offer the ability to have a one-off advisory call with me that you can book straight from my website. So again, 5oaksconsulting.org with the number 5. So with that, I am saying goodbye, dear listeners, and see you again next time at NGO Soul and Strategy.